Today I'm going to talk to you about memory. Memory, when it comes to educational reformers, oftentimes memory is something that they kind of sneer at because, if we look at today's world and education, that's almost all students are asked to do, memorize this stuff and then regurgitate it for a test. That's education. Memorize and regurgitate. Well, usually there's a little bit of time between the memorizing and the regurgitation, but that's basically what people do. They memorize and they regurgitate. After all, we know that being able to demonstrate that you can regurgitate information from memory is pretty critical in education today. Well, today I'm going to talk about actually how memory is structured. What do we know about memory, and how do we know, or what role can this play, and what does this knowledge have to do with how people learn? Robert Bjork tells us, and this is something that we know from our own personal knowledge, is internal experience that we have about memory. He says, past experience of different duration and intensity leave impressions or traces in the brain that are like footprints of differing depths on the sand. And such traces or footprints are subject to blurring over time, becoming harder to read as a function of retention interval and the intervening event. Makes sense. That's how we figure memories work. It's how we feel like, our own subjective experience of memory is. They're like sounds or pictures laid down on a tape, or, bits that are aligned on a memory stick, put into a hard drive. And over time, the tape gets corroded, or the bits get a bit jumbled, and it becomes harder and harder to pull a real memory out of the fog. The footprints in the sand, they just slowly get washed away. And, this common sense view of memory is the memory that we use in education, or education is centered around. If memories are like footprints in the sand, just going over and over these memories, going over and over the beach, like drill, drill, study and study, well, footprints are driven deeper and deeper into the sand, and it gets harder and harder to wash them away. Unfortunately for generations of learners, that's not exactly the reality of how memory is structured. There's all kinds of different distinctions to memory, and some of them are difficult to understand. You have to wonder how some of them fit into learning. In the next couple of videos, I'll be going over these different types of memory and how they work in education. There's your sensory memory, what you see right now. How does that get into short-term memory? Then from short-term to long-term memory, where it's turned into a somatic understanding, or makes sense and meaning. We work with it. It becomes part of our episodic memory. And episodic memory is, kind of what we use for cramming, and do that later. You have declarative and procedural memory, stuff you know how to do and stuff you know how to say. You got stimulus-driven and conceptually driven memories, explicit and implicit memories, controlled and automatic process of memories. There's all kinds of things about memory, and we know about this stuff. It's been studied for years and years and years. It's, almost no wonder that educators haven't focused on it, because it's a bit complicated. Let's have a look at how it's structured, but before we do that, we kind of need to decide, what do you want memory to do? What do we want education to do? What are the goals of education, and what do we have to try to remember? Well, let's think about these goals, because most of the goals in education are long-term goals. The first one should be that the knowledge and skills acquired during learning should be stable and transferable. The information or knowledge should be available at the end of the learning cycle. Pass the memory test, get an A. However, should also be available long afterward, when what has been learned in the formal setting might be useful in some real-world setting. Know how to multiply using fractions on a test doesn't really help out in a kitchen if you can't remember it when you're trying to alter a recipe. Some formal education is focused on almost exclusively how a learner can pass a test. This is a problem for a later video. It's called the problem of transference. Having the information available at another time, another setting or circumstance when it's actually needed. And transference is a huge problem in formal learning or in education. Secondary long-term goal, and it's still pretty vital, is that the knowledge and skills learned, well, they should be able to survive long periods of time when the knowledge and skills aren't used. And then we should be able to recall them in a useful state when we need to. It's kind of like riding a bike. Once you learn how to do it, you can usually do it again after a long period of time when you haven't ridden a bike. It's frustrating to know that you once knew how to do something, or you once knew something, but you can't really remember how to use it, or you can't really remember the knowledge, and you can't really remember how to solve the problem. Although this should be a goal in formal learning, it's actually quite a difficult one to manage. Final long-term memory goal is that we have to produce and have available a mental representation of the knowledge or skill that allows for flexible access to the memory in different settings. This is the second problem with transference, being able to recognize that something that you learn in a different context might be useful in the context that you currently find yourself in. Having a theoretical understanding of a lever doesn't help at all if you don't recognize when it might be useful to have that knowledge. This aspect of transference is one of the most difficult challenges for any kind of formal learning. Educators can and should provide examples for any kind of formal learning. Educators can and should provide examples of when what you've been learning might be useful. But it would be impossible to provide a list. Well, and if you did provide a list, you'd have to, memorize it and be tested on it. Be impossible to provide a list, a comprehensive list of every instance when a person might need to add numbers together. Instead, what we hope is that the learner will master the skill of addition and also recognize every instant in their lives when addition will help solve a problem. Seems simple enough, but transference is one of the most challenging aspects of all of our formal education. Well, this brings us to our final question before really exploring how memory actually works. What is it that we really want memory to do? When we answer that question, we're prepared to consider how memory works and how we can work with memory to get it to do what we want it to do. We want memory to store knowledge and skills that are available for retrieval whenever that knowledge or skill is needed in whatever situation, or to be able to solve whatever problem we have. We also want to be able to recognize that any knowledge or skill is appropriate to apply to whatever situation or problem we might find ourselves in. And passing a test is just not good enough. Just being able to pass a test because you've memorized stuff, we'll get to that on another day, because that seems to be the primary goal of formal education today, is to get information in there that you can use to pass an exam. That's not really what we want. So these are the basics of memory, and what I'm going to do is, over the next week or two, I'll record some more videos about the different aspects of memory. And some of the most important ones that I'm going to touch on is, look, how do we get things from short-term memory and how short-term memory works into long-term memory? And where does episodic memory come into it? Because in education, we use episodic memory a lot. So, there's these couple of different parts of memory and how they apply to education that I'll be doing a video on. And in those videos, I'll actually talk to you about how does this help in the classroom? What can we do to make this happen in the classroom? And how memory works is really one of the big problems with transference. And so let's figure out what memory does, and then maybe we can make a difference in the classroom setting.